how do you find a job? Or maybe you're on the other side trying to hire someone. How do you find the right person? I mean, today, you probably grab your phone, right? Your laptop. You browse some job boards, maybe tweak your LinkedIn profile.
Uh-huh. It feels very digital now, almost instant. Sometimes maybe even overwhelming with all the options.
Exactly. But imagine winding the clock back 100 years,
Much.
200, even 300 years ago. How did people actually connect? How did they deal with that, fundamental challenge of matching someone looking for work with someone who needs a worker?
Well, that problem, that challenge of connecting people, it's ancient, really. It's been around pretty much as long as there have been labor markets. But like you said, the ways people solved it, the methods, they've changed so dramatically over the centuries.
Yeah.
And what's really fascinating and what the research we're digging into today shows is that these changes aren't just about new tech popping up. They're deeply connected to these really powerful economic forces underneath it all, and they reflect massive shifts in, well, society itself.
Absolutely. And that's really the journey we want to take you on in this deep dive. We're going to trace how job advertising evolved, looking at how finding work and workers has changed over like 4 centuries.
Yeah.
And we've got some really compelling stuff here, some proper academic papers that have, painstakingly gone through old newspaper archives, built these complex economic models.
Really rigorous work.
And also research that looks at how job ads are still used as this valuable data source, even right now.
And these sources, they let us go beyond just seeing the changes. They let us get under the hood, so to speak, and understand why these shifts happen. They point to these recurring patterns, these dynamics in the labor market that are honestly surprisingly relevant today.
Couldn't agree more. So our mission for this deep dive is pretty clear. We're going to unpack this rich history, pinpoint the major shifts, and some are really dramatic in how people advertise for jobs and for talent. Yeah. We want to understand the economic engines driving those changes.
Right, the underlying mechanics.
And explore what this, centuries-long view tells us about how labor markets actually work, both back then and maybe what it implies for today. It's taking something that seems simple, like a job ad, and seeing it as this window into some profound economic and social history.
It truly is. So let's start right there with that core idea you brought up, the fundamental problem at the heart of it all, matching.
Okay, let's do it.
Right.
So matching. In economic terms, what are we really talking about here?
Okay, so at its most basic level, the labor market's job is to bring together people who have labor to offer. That's the job seekers with the companies, the firms that need that labor. Economists often think about this using something called the job matching process. You can kind of picture it as the overall result of just countless individual encounters happening all the time between people looking for work and companies looking to hire. And the success rate, how many of those encounters actually lead to someone getting hired, that's summarized by what they call a matching function.
A matching function, like a formula that tells you how well the job market is doing at pairing people up.
Yeah, that's not a bad way to think about it. It's like this black box, right? You put in a certain number of job seekers on one side, a certain number of open jobs on the other, and the function tells you how many successful matches, how many hires you're likely to get out the other end.
Gotcha.
But the tricky part, the reason it's a challenge, is what's inside that box. It's full of things economists call search frictions and imperfect information.
Frictions and imperfect information.
Okay. These are basically transaction costs. They're the barriers, the obstacles that stop job seekers and employers from just instantly finding their perfect match without any effort or cost. I mean, think about it. There could be a perfect job opening across town and a worker who's perfect for it, but they might just not know about each other. That gap, whether it's physical distance or just lack of awareness, that's a friction.
Right. It's not like there's a magic database everyone can see instantly for free.
Exactly. Information isn't perfect, and finding it takes time, effort, sometimes money. So to get over these frictions, to make information flow better and increase the chances of making a match, both sides, the workers looking and the firms hiring, they often have to, invest resources.
So workers spend time searching online, networking, sending out resumes.
And firms spend money on recruiters or posting ads, going to job fairs, things like that.
They're both investing something to bridge that information gap.
Precisely. And this is where the research we're looking at digs into some really fundamental questions that kind of shine a light under the hood of that matching function. Questions like, Which side should really be making that investment? Is it more efficient for the worker to advertise themselves or for the firm to advertise the opening?
And how does the choice one side makes affect the other?
Exactly. How does my decision to invest influence whether you decide to invest? It's not just about the total amount of effort being put in, but about who is putting it in and the strategic interaction between the two sides.
Because it's like a dance, right? My decision depends on what I think you'll do.
Absolutely. It's totally a strategic dance. Whether I decide to post a job ad might depend heavily on whether I think job seekers are actually looking in the places I post it. And your decision to actively search might depend on whether you think firms are bothering to post jobs where you're looking.
And one of the sources we looked at uses this really great, simple analogy to explain this whole strategic thing of the information problem. It's about two blindfolded people on a field trying to find each other.
Oh, yeah, that's a brilliant way to visualize it. Imagine this big open field, right? And you drop two people somewhere in it, both wearing blindfolds. There's some prize they both get, but only if they find each other.
Okay.
Now, if neither of them does anything, if they just stand still or wander around randomly with the blindfolds on, the chances of bumping into each other might be, incredibly low. That's like a market with really high search frictions and nobody investing to overcome them.
A very low chance of a match happening. Or maybe it just takes forever.
Right. But here's the twist. Each person has the option to take off their blindfold. But doing that costs them something. Maybe it's painful, maybe it takes effort, maybe it uses up some limited resource they have. Taking off the blindfold, that's their investment in search and getting information.
Okay, that makes sense. The cost of searching.
So now you've got these strategic choices. If neither takes off their blindfold, they probably stay lost. But what if one person decides, okay, I'll pay the costs, and takes their blindfold off? Now they can see the whole field. They can easily spot the other person who's still blindfolded.
And just walk right over to them.
Exactly. The match happens easily. But notice what happened. The person who invested, who took off their blindfold, they created what economists call a positive externality. Their investment in getting information also benefited the other person, making them findable.
Because their effort helps the other person get the prize too, without that other person having to pay the cost.
Precisely. And that immediately raises the possibility of free riding. If I expect you're going to be the one to take off your blindfold, I might rationally decide, hey, I'll just keep mine on and save the cost. I'll wait for you to find me, knowing you'll bear the cost of searching.
So if I think you'll do the work, I might just stand still.
Right. And the problem is, if we both think that way, neither of us takes off our blindfold and we might never find each other. We both miss out on the prize.
Or maybe we both distrust each other, so we both take off our blindfolds just to be sure, even though only one of us really needed to.
Exactly. So in that simple blindfold scenario, you end up with basically 4 possible outcomes depending on who invests. Neither invests, both stay blindfolded, both invest, both take them off, or only one invests, either person A takes theirs off while B keeps theirs on, or vice versa.
4 possibilities based on their strategies.
Those are the 4 potential outcomes, the sort of stable states this interaction could settle into. And here's the really striking thing the researchers found. These 4 simple outcomes map almost perfectly onto the 4 distinct historical eras of job advertising they identified by looking at centuries of data.
Wow. So it's like the entire labor market over hundreds of years cycled through these different strategic setups, these different answers to the question of who pays for the search.
That's a connection they make. It's powerful because it makes that abstract idea of strategic interaction feel really concrete. It shows that the balance between worker ads and firm ads isn't just random, it's the outcome of these choices playing out on a massive scale, influenced by the changing economic environment.
Okay, that framework is really helpful. So let's use it and actually dive into the history. Before newspapers became this widespread thing, how did people find jobs or workers? What were the methods then?
Well, in those really early times, before mass print media, the methods were primarily physical and extremely local. One source mentions things like, literally posting handwritten notices on shop windows or maybe on the walls of buildings in town squares.
Like a very scattered physical version of a community bulletin board.
Pretty much. You had to physically be there, walking around, looking. And crucially, in smaller, tighter-knit communities, villages, maybe guilds, informal networks were everything. Word of mouth, personal recommendations, that was key. You relied on people you knew, on existing trust.
But that system starts to break down down as cities get bigger and more people are moving around, right? Those informal networks wouldn't cover everyone.
Absolutely. As cities grew, as populations became larger and more mobile, you suddenly needed ways to connect with strangers, people outside your immediate circle, maybe across a wider area. The old word of mouth and local notice system just wasn't efficient enough anymore.
And that's where the newspaper comes in, the game changer.
It really was a revolutionary technology for communication, especially for spreading information widely. While there were earlier forms, the first sort of recognizable newspaper seems to have popped up in Strasbourg around 1605. Compared to hand copying notices or just relying on gossip, newspapers offered something totally new. A way to reach a, quote, widely dispersed audience at a reasonable cost.
So it just massively dropped the cost of broadcasting information to lots of people.
A huge drop. And think about why it was so good for job ads specifically. Later technologies, like maybe early radio or TV ads, they had issues, they were expensive, you had to be listening or watching at the exact right moment. The ads were scattered all over the place.
Right.
Newspapers, though, you could read them whenever you wanted. And importantly for jobs, they could group similar ads together in dedicated sections. If you were looking for work, you learned to turn to, say, the back pages. It made the search part much more efficient than wandering around looking at walls.
Made it easier for both sides, cheaper to post the ad, and easier for people to find the ads relevant to them.
Precisely. You knew where to look to either offer your skills or find someone with the skills you needed. But interestingly, even with this powerful new tool, it took quite a while for employment advertising to really take off. And that brings us to the very first distinct era the researchers identified.
Which maps back to that first blindfold outcome.
Yeah.
Neither side really investing in the search.
Exactly. Era 1. They call it the pre-ad era. This lasted basically from when newspapers first appeared up until around the start of the 19th century. And it's defined by the fact that there were virtually no employment ads in newspapers. Not from workers, not from firms.
And how do we know this wasn't just because newspapers themselves were rare back then?
That's a good question. The researchers didn't just assume, they actually went looking for the evidence. One of the main papers we read conducted this really wide-ranging survey of historical newspapers from the 17th and 18th centuries. Yeah, they looked at papers from England, Ireland, Austria, even colonial newspapers from places like Jamaica, Barbados, India, the American colonies. And their findings, which they summarize in tables, basically showed that employment ads were incredibly rare, almost non-existent. They mentioned the oldest actual employment ad they found in their whole sample was from 1788.
So the technology was there, but people just weren't using it for jobs yet.
Not in any significant systematic way. This pre-ad era really held sway through the 1600s and 1700s. It only started to shift as the Industrial Revolution really got going, starting around the 1760s in Britain and then picking up serious steam in the 19th century. Those massive economic and social changes were the real trigger.
Okay, so the Industrial Revolution kicks in, changes everything, including how people find work. And this moves us into Era 2.
That's right. Era 2, the early era. This covers roughly the 19th century up into the early part of the 20th century. Now, with newspapers becoming cheaper and more common, regular employment ads finally start showing up. But, and this is the key part that might seem surprising to us today, these ads were overwhelmingly placed by job seekers.
Really? So tons of situations wanted ads and not many help wanted from companies.
Exactly the opposite of the pattern most of us are used to from the 20th century. The evidence they present is pretty stark. That DeVaro and Gertler paper gives a snapshot from the New York Times on a single day, October 24th, 1871.
Okay, what did they find?
They counted 138 ads related to employment on that day. Out of those 138, only 8, just 8, were help-wanted ads placed by employers, looking for people like cooks, canvassers, coachmen, seamstresses. The other 130 ads, all situations wanted, placed by individuals looking for work, often even divided up by gender, like situations wanted female.
Wow, less than 6% employer ads. In the New York Times in 1871, that is just hard to picture compared to now.
It's a completely different world, isn't it? And they show it wasn't just a fluke for that one day. They tracked this over time using data from both the London Times and the New York Times.
What did the longer trend show?
Looking at the London Times data, the percentage of employer ads was tiny early on. In 1815, just 4.3%. It bounces around a bit through the century, 21.7% in 1825, down to 12.2% in 1835, up to 25% by 1865, 26.6% in 1875. But generally, it stayed well below 30% for most of the 19th century.
And the New York Times data showed something similar.
Yep, very similar pattern. In 1861, 5.4% employer ads. 1871, that 5.8% we mentioned, then it dipped even lower, 3.7% in 1881, before climbing a bit to 13.2% in 1891 and 15.2% in 1901, but still consistently low. The 19th century was clearly the era where workers were the ones doing the advertising in print. It absolutely was. The burden, the cost of putting that information out there, of making themselves findable, fell mainly on the job seekers. Now, the researchers do point out one really interesting little blip in the London Times data.
Oh yeah, what happened?
In 1845, the percentage of employer ads suddenly jumped way up to 42.9%, just for that period.
43%. That's a huge jump. What was going on in London in 1845?
That specific spike lines up perfectly with the peak of the British railway mania. It was this period of absolutely frenzied investment and construction of railways across the country.
Oh.
This created this sudden, massive, urgent demand for labor, especially for skilled people like surveyors and engineers, and also huge numbers of manual laborers, the navvies. And they often had to offer high wages to get people quickly. This intense, large-scale need basically forced employers to get unusually proactive and flood the newspapers with ads.
So they had to break the usual pattern because the demand was so extreme.
Exactly. The paper even gives examples like ads reading to surveyors and levelers, wanted from 20 to 30 first-rate hands. That kind of direct, high-volume recruitment by firms was really the exception that proved the rule for the 19th century.
Makes sense. A shock to the system, temporarily changing behavior.
Yeah.
But overall, the 19th century was the worker advertising era. What caused that to flip so completely? Because it really did flip, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. That takes us into Era 3, which the researchers call the modern era. This runs roughly from the early 20th century through to the late 20th century. And this is where we see the pattern that probably feels familiar to anyone who grew up reading newspaper classifieds.
Yeah.
Employment ads become completely dominated by employers posting "help wanted."
And the situations wanted ads from workers just vanished.
Pretty much. They became incredibly rare, almost extinct in the print newspapers. This is the era that maps to that third blindfold outcome. Only one side is consistently investing in the search, and now it's the firms.
Got it. The roles totally reversed.
And the numbers are just staggering. Let's go back to the New York Times. Remember 1871, less than 6% employer ads. Now fast forward exactly 100 years to October 24th, 1971. On that day, there were thousands of employment ads filling up whole sections of the paper, and the researchers estimate that something like 96% of those were posted by employers.
96%. Up from under 6. That's not just a flip, that's a total revolution.
It's one of the most dramatic turnarounds you can imagine in how this market functions. And the London Times data shows the same shift happening around the same time, maybe starting a bit earlier. Employer ads there jumped from about 23% in 1905 to over 55% by 1915, crossing that halfway mark.
And it stayed high after
It
that.
kept climbing. 75% in 1945, 92% in 1975, 93% in 1985. In their 1991 sample, it was literally 100% employer ads.
Wow. And the New York Times trajectory.
Same story. Around 23% in 1911, but then a huge jump to 70% by 1941, hitting 95% in 1951. It stayed way up there, mostly in the high 80s and 90s, right through the rest of the 20th century and even into the early 21st. They showed 99.5% in 2001, 98.2% in 2011. The data from these major papers is just overwhelming. The 20th century, for print advertising at least, was the era of the employer ad. Workers largely stopped posting their own ads and shifted their effort to reading the help wanted sections.
Okay, so we've gone from no ads to mostly worker ads to almost entirely employer ads in the papers. What's the fourth era, the one we're basically in now?
Era 4, the Internet era. This really kicks off around the turn of the 21st century as the Internet becomes widespread, and the defining feature here is actually a resurgence of job seeker advertising. But now it's happening alongside continued high volumes of employer posting. It's the outcome where both sides are actively putting information out there again.
Ah, so this lines up with that fourth blindfold outcome. Both sides taking off the blindfolds, both investing in the search. And the driver, again, seems to be cost, right?
Absolutely. The Internet revolution just fundamentally changed the cost structure once more. Posting an ad online or posting your resume online became incredibly cheap. Often the marginal cost, the cost of posting one more ad or updating your profile is basically zero.
Right.
This just drastically lowered the barrier for both sides. It made it easy for job seekers to advertise themselves. Again, think posting a resume on monster.com back in the day, or building a detailed profile on LinkedIn now. And it also made it cheap for employers to post lots and lots of job openings.
It just became feasible, almost expected, for everyone to be active online.
Exactly. Our sources talk about the rise of the big online job boards first. They were way cheaper than print, often used a paper post model, allowed much better targeting of audiences, and you could post or update things instantly.
Yeah, much faster cycle.
Then came the job aggregators, like Indeed. They didn't always host the ads themselves, but they scraped listings from thousands of other sites, making it easier for workers to search in one place. Though that created its own issues for employers sometimes, like maybe getting tons of clicks they had to pay for, but not necessarily quality applicants.
And now, as one source mentioned, we even see job searching and advertising happening on social media like Facebook and Twitter. Super targeted, super low cost.
Yeah, it just shows the ongoing evolution. Technology keeps finding ways to lower the cost and increase the efficiency of sharing this kind of information. So you see this really clear historical path. Pre-ad, neither side posts. Early, mostly workers post. Modern, mostly firms post. And now the internet era, both sides post. It lines up so well with those strategic possibilities from the blindfold story.
That historical arc is absolutely fascinating. But like you said right at the start, these massive shifts weren't just random historical drift. They were driven by real economic forces. This is where that economic model comes in, right? To get at the why behind these big transitions.
Precisely. That strategic coordination game model, developed by Devarro and Gertler, it's specifically designed to understand these dynamics. What it finds is that multiple stable outcomes, economists call them equilibria, can exist in this job search market. And these different stable states correspond directly to the historical eras we just talked through.
Okay, so an equilibrium is like a stable situation where, given what everyone else is doing, nobody has a reason to change their own behavior.
That's exactly it. Like, if firms aren't advertising much, maybe workers don't bother checking newspapers. That's the pre-ad equilibrium. If workers mostly stopped advertising themselves, maybe firms find it more effective to ramp up their own advertising, the modern equilibrium. If the costs drop low enough for everyone, maybe it makes sense for both sides to advertise, the internet equilibrium. The model shows these different patterns can indeed be stable under the right conditions.
And the transitions between eras happen when?
The transitions happen when the underlying economic conditions change. When key parameters in the economy shift, it can make a different equilibrium, a different pattern of behavior, suddenly more attractive or more stable than the old one. It essentially tips the market from one state to another.
Okay, so what were those key parameters? What were the big economic forces driving these huge historical shifts in who advertised?
The research points to several key factors, and they often work together. One of the most fundamental ones is simply the change in the costs associated with advertising, the cost for a firm to post an ad, they label it CUP in the model, and the cost for a worker to read ads or post their own, labeled CL.
Right, the cost of participating. How did those costs change to get us out of that first pre-ad era?
Well, that first big transition from basically no ads to the early era where workers started posting regularly, that's largely attributed to those costs coming down thanks mainly to the Industrial Revolution. The technological advances of the Industrial Revolution weren't just about factories and steam engines. They also dramatically lowered the cost of making paper and running printing presses. This made newspapers much cheaper to produce and sell, which in turn lowered the cost for anyone, firm or individual, to actually place an ad.
Okay, so the cost of getting the ad into the paper went down.
Yes, but there's another crucial piece. The Industrial Revolution also spurred massive investments in public education, leading to huge increases in literacy rates across the population.
People actually had to be able to read the ads.
Exactly. For a print advertising market to function, you need both cheap printing and people who can read the ads and, importantly for the early era, write their own situations wanted ads. Rising literacy effectively lowered the cost for workers and firms to engage with the whole system. It's this combination, cheaper printing plus more literate people, that finally made newspaper job advertising viable on a large scale, triggering that shift into the early era.
Okay, and then the jump into the internet era we're in now, That was just another massive drop in those same costs, but for digital.
Absolutely. The internet just slashed the costs again. Posting an online ad, putting your resume up somewhere, the cost became negligible, often near zero, especially the marginal cost of adding one more listing or tweaking your profile. This technological leap just dramatically cut creep and slale again, making that equilibrium where both sides are active, type D in their model, suddenly very attractive and sustainable.
So cost reduction is key for starting the early era and the internet era. But what about that big flip in the middle? The move from the early era, where workers advertise, to the modern era in the 20th century, where firms completely took over print advertising. What drove that?
That transition seems to be down to several factors changing around the same time, and the model helps disentangle them. One really important factor was the growth in the average size of firms over time. They represent this with the variable N in the model.
Why does firm size matter for who advertises?
Think about it. As the Industrial Revolution matured and industries consolidated, businesses just got much, much bigger. They employed more people. So for a large company that might need to hire dozens or even hundreds of people, placing a single ad in a major newspaper suddenly offered a much bigger potential payoff. That one ad could reach a huge pool of potential workers for multiple positions.
Right. A big factory owner gets way more bang for their buck from one newspaper ad than, say, a small household looking for a single maid back in the 19th century.
Exactly. The benefit to the firm of posting an ad went way up relative to the cost of placing it. So in the model, increasing firm size makes it strategically more appealing for the firm to bear the cost of advertising. That helps explain the shift towards firm dominance.
Okay, bigger firms found it paid off more to advertise. What else was going on that pushed things in that direction?
Another factor they highlight is an increase in overall job mobility and a general reduction in search frictions over time. This is captured by a parameter called EC alpha in their model. Think of it as representing improvements in things like transportation, communication networks, maybe even the development of employment agencies, anything that made it generally easier for workers and jobs to potentially find each other, even without specific advertising.
That sounds like a good thing, right?
Yeah.
Making the market work more smoothly overall.
It often is, yeah. And the model generally shows that increasing NGA can be beneficial. But here's where one of the really interesting kind of counterintuitive findings comes in.
Okay.
While having a higher general efficiency, a higher EC, makes the market smoother, the extra benefit you get from both sides actively advertising and searching compared to just one side doing it actually gets smaller when XI is already high.
Wait, run that by me again. If it's already pretty easy to find someone anyway, the additional effort of both sides looking hard doesn't add as much value.
That's the gist. Think back to the blindfold analogy. If the field is really tiny, so IA is already high, meaning it's easy to find someone, maybe just one person taking off their blindfold is enough to guarantee they find each other quickly. In that case, the additional benefit gained if the second person also takes off their blindfold might be very small.
Okay.
Translate that to the job market. If firms are reliably posting jobs in the newspaper and workers know to look there, so general search is pretty efficient, IA is high, how much does a worker also paying to place a situations wanted ad really increase their odds of being found by those same firms that are already advertising? The extra boost might be minimal. The model shows this additional probability of a match when both sides search actively is related to IA. When I gets close to 1, meaning search is already very efficient, that whole term gets small.
Okay, I think I get it. The marginal return on the second person investing diminishes if the first person's investment, or just the general market efficiency, is already doing most of the work.
Precisely. And because that marginal incentive for the second side to invest gets weaker, it opens the door wider for free riding. If workers figure out, hey, firms are posting all these jobs, my little ad probably won't make much difference and it costs me money, they might rationally decide to just stop posting their own ads and rely on the firm's efforts.
So, weirdly, making the market more efficient overall, increasing Allenite, could actually kill the incentive for one side to participate in advertising, pushing the market towards a state where only the other side does it, like the firm-dominated modern era.
That's the subtle but really important dynamic the model captures. And there's one more big factor they point to that helped drive the decline of worker ads in the 20th century. It's about changes in the relative value workers placed on being employed versus being unemployed. This relates to parameters in the model like the value of having a job versus the value of being unemployed. UW versus U0.
What does that mean in practical terms? How did that value change?
A big part of it is linked to the rise and expansion of social safety nets during the 20th century. Things like unemployment benefits, social security, welfare programs. These programs basically increase the value of the outside option for workers. They raise the value of being unemployed.
Yeah, so if being unemployed wasn't quite the catastrophe it used to be because there was some support.
Then the immediate financial pressure, the absolute urgency for a worker to find any job right away, might lessen compared to earlier times when being jobless could mean utter destitution.
And if you're less desperate, maybe you're less willing to spend your own scarce money placing a situations wanted ad.
That's the logic. If the relative gain from getting a job compared to the now somewhat higher value of being unemployed feels smaller, and you still have to pay the cost to advertise, your incentive to make that investment goes down. This shift in the relative values also helps explain why worker-posted ads became so scarce in the 20th century.
Okay, so putting it all together, that huge flip from the early worker ads to the modern firm ads era was driven by a mix of things. Firms getting bigger made their ads more effective. The market getting generally more efficient might have paradoxically encouraged workers to free ride on firm advertising, and the rise of social safety nets reduced workers' incentive to pay for their own ads.
Exactly. The model weaves these different threads together to show how these simultaneous changes could plausibly tip the entire market equilibrium from one state, worker posting, to another, firm posting. And understanding these dynamics isn't just historically interesting, it has some pretty significant implications for thinking about labor market policy today.
Policy implications, like how governments might try to help people find jobs.
Yeah. The model highlights something potentially quite important, what they call a discontinuous welfare function. What that means is that sometimes relatively small changes in these underlying economic factors may be triggered by a new technology or a government policy can lead to surprisingly large, sudden jumps or drops in the overall welfare or efficiency of the labor market.
Like pushing a button that causes a big, maybe unexpected reaction.
Sort of. It's like the market can get stuck in one equilibrium and a small nudge pushes it over a tipping point into a completely different one, which might be much better or potentially much worse in terms of how many successful matches happen.
Okay.
And remember that counterintuitive finding about check, the general search efficiency. The model suggests that policies focused only on making it easier for people to find jobs if they look, increasing, without changing the costs or incentives to actually post or read ads, could potentially reduce overall welfare in some situations.
That still feels weird. How could making it easier to search be bad?
If making it easier to find someone, hire us, leads to significant free riding, say, workers stop actively advertising themselves because they assume firms will find them anyway, then the total amount of search effort and information being put into the market might actually go down. You lose the benefits, the positive externalities that come from having both sides actively engaged. The model suggests this risk is potentially higher in large developed markets where the basic costs of searching are already quite low, which sounds a bit like some of our modern online job markets.
So just building a super slick platform isn't necessarily the whole answer if it makes one side complacent about putting their own info out there.
That's the potential danger the model flags. The gains from simply making search easier might be canceled out or even reversed if it discourages active participation from one side. What the model suggests might be a better approach are policies aimed directly at decreasing the cost of participating in the search process itself, lowering P best the ill.
Lowering the cost to post ads or the cost effort to read them. Why is that seen as potentially better?
Because the model indicates that lowering those participation costs tends to improve welfare regardless of which equilibrium the market is currently in, it just makes it cheaper for everyone to engage. And, critically, lowering costs enough can potentially trigger a big positive jump in welfare by making that both sides post-equilibrium, like the internet era's Type D, much more stable and attractive than the others. It encourages active participation from everyone without running the same risk of inducing free riding that just boosting general efficiency might.
That's a really nuanced point. It makes you think differently about what helping the job market means. It's not just about connecting people more easily, but about structuring the incentives so both sides want to actively participate in the connection process.
It definitely adds a layer of complexity. It suggests that policymakers need to think carefully about these strategic interactions. Making it cheaper or easier for both workers and firms to actively engage in search seems like a more robust way to improve things than just focusing on general market slickness.
Fascinating. So the economic model helps us understand the why, behind who was advertising and when. But the job ads themselves, they aren't just numbers in a model. They're historical documents too, right? They tell us about the actual jobs, the skills people needed, the whole social vibe of the time.
Oh, absolutely. Looking at the actual content of job ads across the centuries gives you this incredible window into how work itself and the society around it was changing. As one of our sources points out, researchers now use digitized archives of old newspapers like the European Newspapers Project to systematically analyze the specific jobs being advertised, the language used, the qualifications mentioned. It paints a really vivid picture.
It's like taking a time machine right into the classified section of the past.
It really is. And if you look at the 19th century through its job ads, you see certain types of jobs popping up constantly. The sources mention things like shopkeepers, piano teachers, tailors, laundrywomen. That research on Serbian newspapers specifically pulled out examples like doctor, bricklayer, or mason, teacher, pharmacist, pianist. You see this mix of professions, trades, and skilled crafts.
And the ads reflected the social structure of the time too, I imagine.
Definitely. The professional jobs, bankers, doctors, lawyers, those were almost exclusively advertised for and filled by upper-class men who had access to university education. But the growth of cities in the 19th century also meant more demand for middle-class roles like clerks, shop assistants, bookkeepers, and also for skilled artisans and craftsmen.
What about women's roles? What do the 19th century ads tell us about their work?
Well, women's options in the formal job market were much more limited back then, especially in professional or white-collar jobs. Universities often barred women, as did many professions. For educated middle or upper-class women who needed to work, becoming a governess or a nanny for a wealthy family was one of the few respectable avenues you might see advertised.
And for working class women?
For lower-class women, common jobs included factory work, often in pretty harsh sweatshop conditions, laundry work, and hugely significantly, domestic service. Working as a maid, cook, or housekeeper in wealthier homes was one of the single biggest employers of women throughout the 19th century, and you definitely see ads for those positions.
So the ads really paint that picture of a more rigid society, heavily divided by class and gender.
They do. But then, as you move into the 20th century, the ads start to reflect the huge transformations happening with industrialization, new technologies, new industries sprouting up.
You start seeing completely new kinds of jobs advertised.
Exactly. Early 20th century ads would feature roles that were brand new or rapidly expanding. Typists, switchboard operators for the growing telephone networks, technicians to repair all the new machines, key punch operators for early data processing, even elevator operators in the new skyscrapers. Later in the century, you see the rise of ads for bankers, engineers, corporate managers, and nursing becoming a much more prominent, professionalized field.
And how did the picture change for women in the 20th century based on the ads?
That's one of the biggest stories the ads tell. Office jobs, bookkeepers, typists, secretaries became much more common and were seen as increasingly respectable work for middle-class women. There's even a fascinating detail in one source about the invention of the typewriter playing a role.
Oh, yeah.
Apparently, there was this idea that women had smaller, nimbler fingers, better suited to typing. It sounds like a stereotype now, but that perception genuinely influenced hiring and opened up those office roles.
Huh. That's a very specific historical detail.
Isn't it? It shows how social ideas, even stereotypes, interact with technology and shape the job market. Beyond office work, nursing and teaching also solidified as major, respectable professions advertised for women. Then you had World War I, which pulled huge numbers of women into industrial jobs because the men were away fighting. While many women left those jobs after the war, it definitely shifted perceptions and cracked open some doors.
And the trend continued after the war.
Yes, the post-war era saw continued growth, especially in office work and the burgeoning service sector, things like transportation, retail, healthcare, education, government administration, all fueled by new technologies and rising productivity across the economy.
And the numbers really show that shift. One source mentioned that maybe only 20% of women held formal jobs back in the 19th century, but by the end of the 20th century, it was up to around 60%.
Yeah, based on data from around 1999, it's a massive increase in women's participation in the paid workforce, and you can track it clearly through the changing nature of job ads over that century.
And if we look even more recently, say the early 21st century, what kinds of jobs were being highlighted in projections, maybe based partly on ad data, as the ones likely to be prosperous?
One source cited Bureau of Labor Statistics projections for the decade, from 2008 to 2018. Interestingly, while you might think immediately of tech jobs, many of the top occupations listed, based on growth and earnings potential were actually in the medical field. Surgeons, orthodontists, physicians, dentists. Chief executives were high up too. Computer and information systems managers were on the list, but maybe not as dominant as you'd guess. It underscores that even with the tech boom, traditional high-skilled professions requiring extensive education remain really central.
So these job ads, across all these different times, they're more than just notices. They're like little snapshots of the economy, the technology, the social norms, the skills that were valued at that particular moment.
Exactly. They turn out to be incredibly rich, though sometimes complex, sources of data for understanding how labor markets worked then and even how they work now. Which brings us neatly to the last piece we wanted to cover: how researchers actually use job ads as data today, the methods they employ, and the challenges they run into.
Right. I mean, it sounds like there's a whole methodology behind analyzing these things, more than just, browsing old newspapers.
Oh, definitely. One of our sources specifically reviewed the techniques researchers use, especially in fields like library and information science, or LIS. They systematically analyzed job ads to track trends over time, things like how skill requirements for librarians have changed, or how new roles like knowledge manager emerged and evolved.
So the ads are kind of both quantitative data, you can count them, categorize them, and qualitative data, you can read them for meaning.
That's a perfect way to put it. They're discrete items you can tally up, but they also contain text that you can interpret for context, nuances, specific skill mentions. And the motivation for doing this research is often very practical, maybe informing university courses so they teach relevant skills, or helping professional organizations understand how their field is changing.
Okay, so how do they actually go about collecting and analyzing this data? What are the methods and the difficulties?
Well, on the data collection side, the sources are what we've been talking about: digitized historical newspapers, and for current studies, online job boards and aggregators. A common approach is using purposive sampling, maybe targeting ads for a specific profession or from a particular region, or only from certain major newspapers.
But that could introduce bias, right? If you're only looking in certain places.
It absolutely can. True random sampling would be better for generalizability, but it's often harder to implement, so purposive sampling is more common, and researchers need to be aware of the potential biases.
What's a major advantage of using job ads compared to other research methods?
One huge strength is the ability to get really large sample sizes relatively easily and quickly. Think about doing surveys or interviews. You often struggle with low response rates. You need consent. It takes a lot of time. But job ads are just out there, public data. You can potentially collect thousands of ads quite fast, giving you a very broad overview.
The data is just sort of
Why?
available.
For historical print ads archived in libraries or databases, yes, largely. But this is where a massive challenge comes in for researchers studying the current job market using online ads: their impermanence.
Ah, because online ads disappear, right? They're not like a physical newspaper that sits in an archive forever.
Exactly. An online job posting might only be live for a few days or weeks before the position is filled or the listing expires. And crucially, the platforms hosting these ads often don't systematically archive them in a way that's accessible for long-term research.
So if you want to study online ads over time, you can't just go back to an archive later.
Not easily, or often not at all. It means researchers studying current online job markets have to actively collect the data themselves, often setting up regular census points. They might need to scrape or download ads from their target websites every week or every 2 weeks just to build up a data set that captures the market as it changes. This constant need for collection makes it very different from traditional document analysis using stable archives.
Wow, that sounds like a lot of ongoing work just to get the data.
It really is. Then, once they have the data, whether historical or newly collected, the main analysis method is typically content analysis. This means systematically breaking down the text of the ads and coding it.
Coding, what does that involve exactly?
It means applying predefined labels or categories to different parts of the ad text. So you might have codes for specific skills mentioned, like Python or communication skills, or codes for required qualifications like bachelor's degree or 5+ years experience, or codes for job duties like manage a team or develop marketing strategy.
And how is this coding done? By people reading them Or by computers?
It can be either or sometimes a mix. Manual coding, where human researchers read each ad and apply the codes, is very common. It allows for nuanced understanding, but it's incredibly time-consuming, labor-intensive, and you have to worry about consistency, making sure different researchers apply the codes the same way.
Hmm.
Automatic coding uses software to do things like count word frequencies, identify keywords, or analyze which terms appear together. This is much, much faster for large data sets, but it can easily miss subtle meanings, context, or irony that a human reader would catch.
So manual is potentially deeper, but slow and maybe inconsistent, while automatic is fast, but might be superficial.
That's a pretty good summary of the trade-off. And beyond the analysis itself, the source also touches on some ethical considerations when using job ads. Some people argue that analyzing ads is a bit like covert observation of the companies posting them.
Because the company didn't explicitly agree to have their ad used in a study.
Right. They put it out there for recruitment, not necessarily for academic analysis. This leads to questions about whether researchers should anonymize company names or specific contact details when they publish their findings. There's even a sort of fringe debate about whether a job ad could be considered a company's intellectual property, and whether some form of consent should ideally be sought, though that's not standard practice and would be incredibly difficult to implement.
Interesting. Things you wouldn't necessarily think about. So if we sum up the research perspective, what are the main pros and cons of using job ads as data?
Okay, so strengths. Definitely the potential for large sample sizes and the relative accessibility compared to getting data directly from people or firms. Weaknesses include the data can sometimes feel a bit superficial or atomistic, like deep context. There's that risk of sampling bias if it's not random. The huge challenge of data permanence and the need for constant collection with online ads, the fact that manual coding is slow and hard to keep consistent, and perhaps that advanced statistical or automated text analysis methods haven't been adopted as widely in some studies using this data compared to other fields.
So it's a really valuable resource, a potential treasure trove, but extracting reliable insights requires careful, sophisticated methods to handle its quirks.
Precisely. It's a powerful but demanding data source that has revealed so much about all the dynamics we've been discussing today.
Wow. This deep dive has really taken us on quite a journey, hasn't it? From, like, handwritten notes on walls centuries ago, all the way to today's complex online job platforms, and all viewed through this lens of strategic choices and economic forces.
It really has. We've traced this fascinating evolution of how job seekers and employers actually find each other. We saw the pattern shift from basically nobody advertising to workers taking the lead, then firms completely dominating print advertising, and finally landing in today's digital world where both sides are highly active again.
And crucially, we saw these weren't just random changes in fashion. They were direct responses to really powerful economic drivers, like the cost of sharing information plummeting, businesses getting bigger and changing structure, the general ease of searching improving over time, and even major societal shifts like social safety nets and the changing role of women in the workforce.
And how all those forces shaped the strategic calculations of workers and firms who should bear the cost and effort of searching and advertising. And how the answers to that question determined the whole nature of the job matching market in different historical eras.
And then finally, how these job ads themselves, these seemingly simple notices, are actually incredibly rich sources of data for researchers, offering glimpses into past labor markets, skill demands, social structures, even though studying them systematically comes with its own set of challenges, especially in the digital age.
It really brings home that the fundamental problem is still the same: reducing friction and bridging information gaps to make that match happen. The tools are just wildly different now, leveraging the power and low cost of digital platforms, which in turn might be creating new market dynamics and equilibria.
Which leads us right back to that really thought-provoking, maybe slightly unsettling, implication from the economic model we talked about earlier. Thinking about those complex, sometimes counterintuitive welfare effects, like how making search generally easier could potentially backfire by encouraging free riding, or how lowering the actual cost of participation might be a better policy lever. What does our ongoing evolution towards these hyper-targeted, maybe even fragmented online job markets actually mean for the overall efficiency of the labor market? And maybe even more importantly, what does it mean for the individual person trying to navigate this incredibly complex and constantly shifting landscape to find the right job in the years ahead?